Hey, what is up, mortals? It is Sam Gabriel here, and welcome to What If Deku Was in 1B Part 14. Just wanted to greet you guys by just saying sit back and relax, you're in for a treat, so we begin. A loud ricochet rang across the battlefield, knocking out 4 of the 6 villains that surrounded Izuku. Torino! It was a relieving sight, but not enough, as the symbol of peace was still unnerved by the announcement. Toshinori! The strict voice stirred the number 1 as he turns to look at the retired man. The old eyes sent a look of pity toward the man-child who lashed out like a lost cause. He's beyond help. Your priority is to get Midoriya back. At the mention of his student, All Might returns to reality, but All for One had other ideas. Force quirk activation. The indecisive successor of Darkness still wanted to stay put, but with his body radiating a soft blue glow, Shigaraki felt a pull. A thin line from his body connected to the illuminated toga who shone red. Magnetism. Huh? Izuku panicked as his own body turned blue. Instantly, One for All flowed through his veins and the greenette held onto the ground. Midoriya! Torino tried to assist, but the reigning king of the underground kept him at bay. The student could only stand there helplessly in front of the open portal. The unconscious Magna was lifted by crimson-black protrusions that extended from All for One's fingers, and the greenette paled. If he throws her at me, I'm not going to be able to hold on. Time seemed to slow down as villains were thrown in Izuku's direction. All for One stood there condescendingly, and the heroes could do nothing. Shigaraki disappeared within the portal, and just as Magna was about to make contact with the rigid child, a simultaneous yell rang out. Run! Get out of the way! A flashy explosion erupted before Izuku's eyes. It came from out of nowhere, just as Magna's body seems to curve weirdly to the side. The magnetism that held the student hostage dissipated, and the greenette didn't hesitate. He ran. He turned to see that Kurohito had merged with All for One's breathing apparatus and was doing something. Whatever it was effective as the 2 quirks that were forcefully activated ceased, and the portal closed. Magna landed on the floor near the unconscious Dabi, but there was no time to see. Izuku's eyes followed a familiar spark and ended up landing near Monoma, who signaled Kurohito to flee. Vanta Black ran down the dark suit and disappeared into the shadows, escaping from the scene. We need to get out of here! Bakugo was almost dragging the exhausted Izuku as Monoma aided Tokage. Her arm was missing, but none of that was important at that moment. Before All for One could compose himself to take control again, All Might and Torino took action. Whatever was happening in that fight was no longer their concern. Rushing to the safety of Kamino Ward's busy roads, the students collapsed in a side street. That was close. Izuku huffed as he looked toward those who saved him. Even though he wanted to mutter a string of worried questions, now wasn't the time. Thanks. You guys saved me. Monoma and Tokage smiled as Kurohito gently punched his shoulder. I was just fulfilling my promise to keep you safe. Did you really think we could just sit there? I only came because Tokage would have tried to take that villain alone if I wasn't here. You know she's irrational when it comes to big decisions. Hey! Bakugo watched the mini-reunion unfold. A wide smile was painted on Izuku's face, and if no one knew better, the kidnapping seemed to be nothing more than a horrible nightmare. The freckled boy was laughing as he was scolding Kurohito for being reckless, only to get a mimicking scolding from Monoma. Tokage, as usual, was just trying to make peace as her arm had finished regenerating. How did you guys even pull that off? While mixing with the crowds, Izuku was curious about their side of the story. Monoma sighed before explaining. He had copied Tokage's quirk as the greenette herself used her body to carry some of Bakugo's nitroglycerin. They decided it was better for Monoma to aid Izuku since he wouldn't have the quirk long enough to regenerate. Kurohito was sent into the shadows, and all that was left was to wait for timing. Everything had seemed hopeless and impossible to fix when Bakugo's keen eyes spotted the opening, the black breathing mask. And you know the rest. Kurohito was a distraction to free you. Tokage used the discharge from your quirk to set the explosion off. Blind spot created. I was supposed to be there to guide you to us, but ended up pushing that villain out of the way. Bakugo's signal flare, then the retreat. The 4 of them winded around the streets when forest green eyes paused to gaze up at the screen. Wait. The emerald pupils widened with fear as they landed on not All Might, but Toshinori. The skeletal man was displayed on every screen in Japan for all to see. No. All for One could be seen with his suit torn and blood dripping from under the mask, but Toshinori was worse off as he faced his nemesis. Both powerhouses were in pain, and the fight on screen caused panic to swell. In times of danger, appearance didn't matter. All that was important was that All Might won, and the shout that crescendoed from the streets only served to prove that point. The crowd started to yell and pray for their symbol's victory, and it wasn't just them. It was everyone. From the people in the streets to the ones yelling at a TV screen, the sheer willpower seemed to make the air itself heavy with tension. The suspense was enough to make anyone weak in the knees, and there was nothing they could do about it. Nothing. Nothing but yell. It couldn't even be considered yelling, more like a plea for help, a desperate plea which only swelled up further as the students joined too, starting to scream along. Waves of intense emotion welled up from the pits of Izuku's stomach as he watched the fight. All Might will save everyone, right? Flashbacks from when he was a child flickered through the Greenette's overwhelmed mind. Innocent admiration he carried all his life seemed to shake. All for One stood up, wiping the blood dripping from his face as a monstrosity of an arm started to bulge. It was the ultimate combination his body could accumulate, and his opponent did the same. All Might is going to save everyone, right? Bakugo, someone who shared Izuku's past, also felt his emotions shake. After all, the symbol of peace was his goal. And to do that, they must always be the winner. It didn't matter if they haven't spoken to each other in their lives. One thing was true. Their paths in life, which were dancing around each other, finally crossed as the two looked up desperately at the screen. Save everyone. Please. All Might! All Might! United States of Space! The wind howled like a cheer of hope as the clouds cleared and skies parted. A hurricane had erupted in the fight zone. Debris cleared, and at the sight of All for One's body slamming into the ground, victory came rushing in. He did it! All Might won! Screams of joy erupted from every household in Japan as All Might's name was yelled out with tears of relief. People jumped around, and the cheers only became louder as Toshinori's arm was raised into the air. The other nearby pros immediately went to help anyone caught underneath the rubble. The reporter landed their helicopter nearby to relay the damage. That was when it happened. Come on. We need to go take responsibility for committing a crime. Tokage said it so casually that she got playfully shoved by Kurohito, who rolled his eyes. It is a serious offense. I may not regret it, but what we did was a villain's act. Silence suddenly rained down, even though there were hundreds present, as a finger pointed at the camera. Next! Izuku stopped walking after the girl as he paused to look around. The close-up of Toshinori's fingers seemed to dig right through his soul as the next words rang out. Next! It's your turn! The country was filled with exhilaration and jovial jumping, but among the carefree masses, a certain Greenette couldn't join in. He had understood the secret message to him, and tears welled up in his emerald green eyes. The symbol of peace was no more. The embers of One for All had completely disappeared, and the mantle he held was all that was left. Originally, Izuku had thought All Might would be there until he could take up his spot as number one, but now... The Greenette couldn't cry as he looked down at his own hands, only an hour ago in cuffs. If I didn't get kidnapped, then All Might would have pushed this fight to a later date. I could have been stronger and then fought by his side. I was, this time, only in his way. Only in his way. The buds of uncertainty gnawed at his confidence, and phantom force seemed to weigh down on the scarred palms. Irrational thoughts ran through his head. Despite the sniffles ready to escape, something within the student cracked. The hands that were ready to wipe a messy face fell limply by his side, as the pained expression seemed to lose emotion. Instead of flowing out, the grief concentrated in the emerald eyes, and not a sound escaped the boy. Becoming numb, the Greenette stared blankly at the screen, as a single stream of tears ran down the side of his cheek. Did I And the symbol of peace? The next few days were hectic, to say the least. Luckily, the reporter camera hadn't arrived when the mini rescue squad jumped out, so instead of telling the truth and being forced to deal with the consequences, Vlad just agreed to hide the truth with a couple of lies. With the story following that the Greenette was saved during the initial attack, the children managed to get away with the rule-breaking provided they worked hard. Other changes included the now empty seats for the top of both her hero and the underworld. All Might had officially retired, and All for One was taken to Tartarus along with 2 villains, Dobby and Magna. They had been found unconscious on site. Without leading figures on either side, every citizen was shaken. There were a bunch of complications with dorm moves, too, and although most were fine, Toshinori and Vlad knew the next would be difficult. They stood outside the Midoriya household, and the retired hero knocked on the door. At first, Toshinori wanted to go in alone, but since the Greenette had been the one to be kidnapped, the homeroom teacher insisted he would go too. "But please, come in." Despite the nervous welcome and friendly smile, at the mention of the dorm move notice, Inko's expression changed.
I believe we sent a notice in the mail first."
Vlad was nervous too, since the mother seemed tense. Izuku wasn't making eye contact with anyone and was instead looking down at the table. "Yes, about that." The Greenette grit his teeth before getting up. Not making a sound, he left the room. Inko sighed as she looked at her son's back before facing the teachers. "I have already spoken to Izuku. The day I received the notice, I told him that I was against the idea." The teachers didn't speak as the teary mother looked at the open door. "I didn't want to risk my baby getting kidnapped again because, well, apart from the normal, do you know what that child said? He told me that he was glad to be caught." The teacher's eyes widened up a little as they heard this, and the mother continued, "In place of others. My son told me with his own mouth that he was grateful that no one else was hurt. He was grateful that no one else had to go through what he did. Izuku, he didn't care for his own self, as long as others were safe." It was a habit the teachers knew very well firsthand. The student seemed to jump in head first to all problems just to save everyone. But as his mother, I couldn't just stand by and watch. Izuku's quirk never appeared like the other kids, and since he entered UA, he's only been getting more and more. The woman's body shook as she spoke, and large, clear eyes fell to the table. She looked directly at the teachers sitting in front of her. "I don't have the nerves of steel and heat to entrust my son to UA High School as it—" The door slammed open as Izuku walked in, and the boy held up a letter. "Izuku!" "Mom!" Holding up the paper, Inko could see that it was a messily written thank you note. "It doesn't have to be UA. It doesn't matter where I go. When I received this, it made me the happiest person because for a moment I was someone's hero." The child sat on the floor and faced his mother, head bowed down. "If you can't accept UA, then I'll just go to a different school. As long as there's a hero course, I can be a hero." Vlad watched his student beg his mother, and got up from his chair. The homeroom teacher sat next to the Greenette and faced the crying parent.
"As his homeroom teacher, I am the one who watches over his progress. Although I am personally against such a promising student leaving, if Izuku were to transfer away, I'll do my best to give his next teacher all the notes I have collected so far in his journey. I can only apologize for my mistakes."
Inko's lips quivered as she was about to talk, when All Might suddenly buffed up. He joined the other two on the floor and bowed his head all the way down. "All Might?" "I apologize for doing things out of order. But I believe that young Izuku is the right person to succeed me. What I mean is, I believe he is the person to become the next symbol of peace." Eyes widened as the other three in the room couldn't keep up with what All Might just said. "Oh, what? Wait a minute, please stop. What is this?" "An apology, as the one who was formerly the symbol of peace." The homeroom teacher noticed Izuku react to what Toshinori said, and placed a hand on his student's head. The Greenette stayed silent as All Might continued talking. He spoke about how he was weak, and again apologized for his ignorance. "We understand that the UA heroes can't continue like this. We are trying to change." Vlad also bowed his head down as All Might faced Inko. "Is there any way you can look not at the current UA, but at the future UA? I will protect and raise him, even if I have to give up my life to do so. The last line was too much for Inko as she fell to the floor. Mom! I don't like this at all. She gestured for the two, bowing down to raise their heads, and looked at her son. With a sigh, she smiled sadly at the homeroom teacher. I saw your sincerity during the press conference. There truly was no need for this. And All Might... She faced the former symbol of peace and then her son. You make Izuku so happy when I can't. It's not that I hate Yue, I just want my son to be happy. Izuku looked hopefully at his mother, and the woman smiled. So don't give up on your life. Please live properly to protect and raise him. Good as that. Inko stood up and gave her son a hug. Then I'll allow it. With permission finally granted, the next day was chaos as students moved into dorms. The first night had a room competition, but apart from that, life was returning to normal. Since summer camp was a bust, Vlad borrowed Ground Gamma and Cementos. It was decided that for the next 10 days, the students would have extensive training, where they would need to create at least 2 ultimate moves. An improvement to their costume was also a must. After all, this was all preparation for the provisional license exam. Everyone was making headway with their ultimate moves, and although Izuku was focusing on new styles, an idea had finally solidified. The Greenette looked down at his changed costume. I got the idea of full cowling from Monoma, Katchan, and Gran Torino. He bounced on the soles of his feet and jumped high into the air before using the close quarters to accelerate himself. Becoming a blur to the clone, the Greenette rotated his body in the air before crashing down. His fight style slightly resembled someone in his class, and it was evident as the Greenette used his body weight to fight. A combination of Gran Torino and Kaibara, one for all, full cowling, drill style. It was tough. That was an understatement. The first semester flew by, and much happens to 1B. Not only had their indoor school summer camp ended, but their provisional hero licenses too. We did it! Cheers erupted from 1B as they looked at the scoreboard displayed. Through their diligence and unyielding dedication, everything finally paid off. Not a single student was left behind. In a sense, it wasn't surprising. The exam gave those who worked together an advantage, and since the class had always been there for each other, ironically, it ensured the whole class's victory. Back to normal classes starting tomorrow, huh? Awase stretched out his arms as most of 1B lazed around the common room. No rest for heroes! Hononuki nodded and the class carried on with their merry chatter. Izuku was sitting with Tokage and Komori on the sofa with Iwasa leading from behind. But man, a lot has happened, you know? Tetsutetsu joined in with the conversation as he sat on the floor. He and Shiozaki had been talking with Pony and everyone agreed. They truly had been through a lot, and there was still a small problem they hadn't dealt with. That was talking to Izuku. The Greenette had become a little emotionally distant from the class since his kidnapping, and although no one said anything, there was a class agreement to make sure he was never alone. If the freckled boy didn't want to talk, no one was going to force him. Instead, they would just wait for him to speak instead, and unconsciously made sure Izuku was surrounded by his friends. The class did know about the impromptu rescue mission, and although their opinions were split between saving and waiting back at the hospital, it didn't change the fact that everyone just wanted the Greenette to feel safe. Nothing else. That was, until Monoma walked over. We need to talk. The class quietened as Monoma walked toward the front door and Izuku looked at the rest of his classmates. No one spoke, and the Greenette smiled. He was glad to have understanding friends who would always be there for him, and got up to run after the blonde. You're not going? Awase glanced at Tokage, who just smiled. Sometimes the more support you have, the less likely you are to be honest. Monoma didn't say anything, and Deku didn't ask for me to come, so... She let out her usual toothy grin. Although she was curious, she knew that sometimes people just needed space. At the end of the day, she would still have Izuku's back. So I won't do anything. Monoma, how far are we going? Izuku knew his class were being considerate for his slight change in attitude, and that no matter how hard he tried to hide it, they would see through him. He also knew that Monoma was going to ask questions now, because that was how the blonde acted. However, what he didn't expect was to meet someone else as they arrived in Ground Gamma. Katchan? What are you doing here? I told him to. Izuku turned to look at Monoma, who stood next to Bakugo. It was surprising to see them not fight, but instead seemed to be working together. We already spoke, and, well, All Might. Monoma paused, and Bakugo continued.
I've been thinking about it since the first hero training. You got it from him, didn't you? Your power.
The greenette held his breath, and Monoma sighed. I wasn't sure what that meant at first, but I figured out my own answers. I'll be honest, the way you acted during the USJ was suspicious. Izuku's eyes widened slightly as Monoma explained. Your worry for All Might at the end of the fight was an irregularity. Even then, I just figured that you knew about All Might's true form from before the reveal. The greenette nodded meekly as his classmates sighed. I won't bother asking how, since it was obviously an international secret. Monoma paused as Bakugo spoke.
That boss villain. He can apparently give and steal quirks. It's hard to believe, but one of those old cat ladies lost her quirk and can't work anymore.
Bakugo was talking about Pixie Bob, and Monoma added more information in. He had figured it out from their first interaction. The excuse of being a ridiculously late bloomer and the lack of control. It would have been believable, except you seemed to be mastering the quirk at record speeds. An anomaly, since you had more than enough time to work it out, late bloomer or not. Since you couldn't, it meant the quirk appeared just before UA.
You changed after you met All Might. And then what All Might said after he beat the boss villain.
Both blondes looked at the frozen greenette and remembered the silent crying in the middle of a happy crowd. The two seemed to be the only ones who noticed it, which was why they met up and spoke.
You two are both correct.
They turned to see Toshinori walking over, and Izuku had instantly looked guilty. I'm sorry I couldn't keep a secret, All Might. Looking down at the ground with his face twisting in guilt, the student couldn't face the former pillar.
It's quite all right, young Midoriya. I have people I trust who know the truth around me too, don't I? You've met multiple people already. I trust your judgment and have faith in that.
The retired man put a hand to the student's hair, and Izuku raised his head, still avoiding eye contact. Toshinori then turned to the two blondes and confirmed everything that they had questions for.
I had told him to keep a secret, but since you two have figured it out on your own, then it was the result of my own negligence.
The retired man then smiled at the other two.
But as I said, you are both correct. Young Midoriya now carries my quirk.
It was an informative night. Filled to the brim with both surprises and secrets, Bakugo and Monoma learned the truth of One for All. It made Izuku uncomfortable for making his mentor fill up the mistakes he'd made, but the retired hero didn't mind. In a way, this was his first step to fulfilling Inko's promise. By the end of the night, the two blondes were now people who shared the large weight on the greenette's shoulders, people who now understood the truth of the burden. Bakugo, someone who shared Izuku's past, and Monoma, someone who shared the present. It was relieving to have the responsibility lightened, even just a little, and it made the greenette finally able to make eye contact again. His thoughts were still a mess, but at least now, his secrets weren't his alone. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video, so goodbye and have a divine day.
All Might!